Nikolaj Ehlers might be on the way out, and with the Jets needing a decent return for him, but unlikely to get a lot, is this a rumor we should really trust, or is Winnipeg perhaps going to be patient with the young winger? Find out on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, Jets fans, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, like I said, wanted to spend some time talking about some of the rumors around Nikolaj Ehlers. Nothing earth-shattering that's new, I would say, but perhaps some implication that this is a two-way street and that, for what the Jets may be shopping him for and for the player's own preferences, it might be time to bid our favorite Dane farewell. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. Before we go any further, though, just wanted to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Download the FanDuel app and make every moment more, because right now new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Now, like I said, you've been hearing about Nikolaj Ehlers for a while now. It's not a surprise. There is a reasonable chance that the young Dane is perhaps thinking of departing. And I think that for a lot of folks is pretty tough to swallow. I know from my own perspective, I've mentioned this in the past, but I've always been a big fan of his. And I felt that he's never really gotten the fair shake with the Jets the way that he deserves. He's a good player. I think he's very skilled. And I think in a lot of ways, he has a couple of crucial skill sets that Winnipeg desperately lacks. And so when he leaves, it's going to be a tougher role for the Jets to fill, because Ehlers, despite not playing a lot, has traditionally been one of our highest 5v5 scoring rate players, and also helps a lot with transition, which is nothing new. We've talked about this before. And so, replacing that, not going to be so straightforward. It's great that Brad Lambert looks like he might be a similar kind of player, but by the same token, if you're just trading one player for another, it doesn't really help improve your team in the present term. It might for the long term, but if Brad becomes anything like Ehlers in any respect, that's a bit of a home run. So tough call there. Not loving that, but Pagnotta reported earlier today, and look, Pagnotta has had some reputation issues. He hasn't always been right about things, but he has suggested that a source close to the Jets is indicating Ehlers is open to a change. He hasn't requested a trade, but he has said that he is perhaps more open-minded about a change of scenery, which, based on how things have gone, I don't think that that's really a shock. With his sort of non-committal answers the last few weeks when it comes to, the stuff after the playoffs, right? Would he commit to the Jets long-term and follow the new regime? And doesn't really seem to be abundantly married to the Jets, which I think if you're Winnipeg is probably not unexpected. I think that the relationship between him and the team probably isn't as great as it could be. I don't think it's as bad as the Dubois relationship necessarily. I think Dubois actively wanted out. I think with Ehlers, it's more like he'll play this coming season in Winnipeg if it comes down to it, but he would probably prefer, or at least be open to the idea of switching squads, because he's not going to extend. I think that was one thing that was pretty clear from what Pagnotta said, is that Ehlers is not interested in signing a new contract with the Jets. And again, we've kind of talked about that being a potential situation for a while now. It's not shocking. It's not surprising. It's pretty much on the money in terms of what I think we've seen from his camp and what logic kind of dictates. We've heard from supposed rumored agents from other players and stuff, or GMs, that really Nick has no incentive to resign. So him suggesting that he might be okay with leaving is not exactly an earth-shattering statement. It's more, it just sucks. And I think for Winnipeg, Jets fans are going to find out really quickly how hard it is to find a player who does what Nikolaj Ehlers does. And look, no one's saying that Ehlers is like a top 10 player in the NHL, but on this team, he had a very pivotal role and was underutilized. It was crazy to say because, for as great as he is, he just never really got the ice time he deserved. And, that's been a huge point of frustration. I think if things had gone differently and Arniel had, perhaps been able to step in earlier and sort of preach this youth movement, maybe you could have repaired the bridge. But I think multiple years of dealing with Maurice and Lowry and Bones all not really giving him the time of day kind of tells you where that is. I don't even think that Arniel stepping into the coaching role this coming season is going to be enough to change that. It could technically happen, but I think at this point, I think both parties are probably looking more for a divorce, which, again, like I said, it's not shocking, and I don't think anyone is abundantly surprised that it's going this direction, but it just sucks. Like I said, I think it's very hard to find a player who can do what Ehlers does and do it at the level that he does. This particular skill set that he's got is uncommon, and, sure, Lambert might be a pretty good player at some point, but asking him to fill that void as soon as this upcoming year is probably a little too much. So some food for thought there. I think this separation is probably going to happen relatively soon. I don't know if it's going to happen before the draft, but I would imagine sometime afterwards we might see something. So brace yourselves. The Jets trade for Ehlers is probably coming, and it could be a bit of a doozy. It might not be very good from a Winnipeg fan perspective, but let's just cross our fingers and hope that maybe there's a surprise in store. But like I said, for the Jets, some hard decisions are ahead, but I think the biggest question is, what is next? What are the Jets going to give us in the coming weeks? And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Before we go any further, though, I did want to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel's giving you a shot to bring home a big victory of your own. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. If you are betting perhaps on the Oilers or Panthers, this is a great opportunity because, one of these teams is going to win. And if you think that it might be time for Paul Maurice to get his ring, perhaps you're rooting for him. He's had one, as like an assistant coach or something, or very nearly at least. But as a head coach, he's never had it. So this is a pretty big deal for him. Obviously, I think some Jets fans still hold a candle for him and probably wish he was still behind the bench. But, maybe you're hoping that Canada's cup drought finally ends. Personally, not going to be me. You won't catch me rooting for the Oilers, but maybe somebody out there is comfortable with being a bit of a turncoat. Regardless, though, if you think that it's time for a big McDavid performance in the Cup Finals, you could cast a bet on what he might do in this upcoming series, or maybe you want to cast a bet on Barkov, who has been a traditionally fantastic player for the Panthers. No matter what, you should visit FanDuel.com/lockedon so that you can make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for joining us on tonight's episode as we are just talking about some fun stuff with the Jets and some complicated questions about what is going to happen this offseason. And I think it's been relatively quiet since the Arniel appointment. I think that was one of the biggest questions, and then things have kind of settled down. And so we're sort of in a holding pattern, right? I want to talk about what could be on the horizon here over the next few weeks. But before we get into that, just wanted to reach out to all of you who are Fox Sports or ESPN watchers. If you find yourselves having to turn down the volume because there's too much shouting, you should make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you daily to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. All part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, like I said, what comes next for the Jets? This is a tough question. For me, I tend to lean towards the assistant coaches being acquired. I think that's going to be settled sometime in the next 2 to 3 weeks. I think Arneal has his short list at this point. He's had plenty of time to go through some interviews, and he's probably spoken to plenty of people. He may also not be like super interested in rushing it until he has his analytics summit, but I do kind of think you want to have assistant coaches nailed by then, which may happen before the draft. Maybe it happens afterwards. I'd be curious if they bring them in before the draft, just because, I don't want to say that like the coaching staff's going to have a tremendous influence on the draft, but I think it could be helpful to get guys on the same page about what they could envision roles being for players in the near future. With the drafted guys, though, obviously, you're going to have the CHL requirements, which somebody helpfully reminded me on the Jacob Julian story. Thank you for that. Obviously, you have to have the whole 3 years thing. And NCAA eligibility is always a challenge, too. So, none of the players that are coming out of Winnipeg's picks this year are likely to make the jump immediately. It's going to be a few years before most of them are impact NHLers, but maybe the coaching staff has some sort of consultation on the process just to sort of talk through what they could be at some point, right? But this is primarily going to be with the scouts in front office. That said, the coaching staff may still make those hirings to start the planning, right? You have to kind of get the ball rolling, whether it's for the summit or camp or preseason, because while it is summer now and we haven't hit the Cup finals, technically, next season's actually not that far away. It's only a few months. And when you think about how much preparation and work has to go into changing the coaching staff over and going through all of these different roster turnovers and stuff, it's a lot of work in a very short period of time that only feels long because you're not watching it on TV. But for most organizations, I'm sure there is a ton of movement. The guys are going to go home for summer and golf and whatever, but in the offices, I could still imagine quite a bit of behind-the-scenes work ongoing. After the assistant coaches are appointed, I think the next order of business is to figure out what you're doing with the roster, because you've still got to figure out a second-line center option and perhaps a defender. Dylan DeMello, I think, is probably a foregone conclusion to extend. I really don't see the Jets letting him go. I think he's just too valuable to this franchise. And with Dylan potentially being linked to the Canucks and some overtures being made in that direction, I think that's probably where he'll sign. Like I've mentioned on the previous episode, it is going to suck when he leaves. I think he's one of the veterans where, I wouldn't complain if he came back, but I just don't think it's likely. I think with what the Jets need at this point, the direction that they want to take the team and some cap and salary considerations, I just don't see a fit. I think at this point he deserves a raise. It's probably not going to be with the Jets. And if he goes back to Vancouver, I think it would actually make a lot of sense. So food for thought there. But, for me, I really would like to see Winnipeg make a big splash, because this offseason really does hold some tremendous implications for Winnipeg's competitive window, whether it's going to be abbreviated or if they're going to find a way to prolong it. That's kind of been sort of the question that's been on everyone's lips, is how they approach, the roster gaps and getting this team back into a more playoff competitive state. Not a team that makes the playoffs, but one that actually succeeds and thrives in it, because traditionally the Jets are kind of like a one and done sort of situation in the postseason. We've seen that, unfortunately, a painful number of times recently. I'm hoping that they change this upcoming year and beyond. It'd be nice if the Jets won more than one game in a playoff round, let alone the first round that they play in. So, stuff would be nice if the Jets were just fun. But, as it is, they were still a really good regular season team. They will probably be a pretty decent regular season team this year. I just think if you're trying to tick off boxes on your I guess to-do list, coaching staff first, player acquisition second, and from there you can maybe add on some sweeteners. I think Winnipeg is going to be limited in the amount of moves that they're capable of making, and I think it's going to come down to some opportunities, right? There are going to be teams that are going to have to cut salary. There are going to be teams that need to move players. One thing I kind of wonder out there is if Marty Necas becomes the guy the Jets target. I've alluded to this not being my favorite move, in part because I feel like he kind of has some of the same issues that Kyle Connor does, in that, look, he's a skilled finisher and he'll help down low. But in terms of a guy who's going to drive play and be a top-end center, he's so far not really shown something that I think would merit a big raise of like 7 by 7.5 or 8 million. And like the fact that the Canes don't want to give that to him, I think to me tells me a lot about what his perceived value internally is. The Canes are a smart team, and sure, you could argue that they've had some playoff success issues, but overall, when it comes to how they've built their roster and stuff, they've got a pretty good sense of things. They have a smart staff. I think they have a good read on most of their players. And the fact that the Necas extension talks have kind of been staggered tells me that, they're not really keen to pay a lot of money for a player that perhaps isn't worth, nearly top line money. 7 or 8 million in a couple of years might not seem like a lot, but in the present, it's still pretty good cash. And I think Necas probably is more in the middle 6 center category than he is the top 6. It could totally change this upcoming year. Maybe he really takes a step forward and becomes a player that really surprises and impresses people. And I mean, that'd be great if that was the case. I just don't know if that's a gamble I want the Jets to make. If their scouts feel that he can, I'm open to the discussion, but I think most likely what you see with him right now is most likely what he's going to be throughout some of his prime years. Again, I'm open to being wrong, and there's a chance that a smart coach can get more out of him and maybe turn him into a player that he doesn't appear to be right now. We've seen, some guys really blossom, like Morrissey, who had many of the traits and tool sets of a top-end player, didn't play like an elite super number one defender until Bones came in. Rick sort of unleashed his potential. And so if you want to bank on that, I could see an argument there. It's not the argument that I would use. And I think, when you're talking about essentially making a pretty big gamble on a huge salaried contract like this, I just don't think the Jets are in that kind of position. It's tough. Necas, skilled player. He clearly can finish the daylights out of opportunities. I just don't think he should do it for the Jets. I think he will do it for somebody. I don't think it's going to be Winnipeg. I could see him extending in Carolina if things pan out right and his agent can get a reasonable deal. I don't know that it's going to be like 8 million good, but it'll probably be somewhere in the 6.5 range is my guess. That's if they go that route. Maybe they trade him and try to get a little bit of a valuation surcharge in a trade package. Although, let me tell you, if you're struggling to convince yourself that a player is worth a lot of money and you don't want to pay him, I can't imagine that that's going to be great for whatever trade return the Canes might be envisioning with Necas. So lots of stuff there. I'm open to the idea of a trade like this if the package going back isn't crazy. I think that's the same thing where I'm kind of at with like a Trevor Zegras or something. Zegras might be on the way out. He might be available. Maybe the Ducks would want to take a chance on Ehlers and perhaps have a scene change for both players. Zegras, again, has some KFC kind of stuff, but, he's still a skilled finisher, and he may not cost as much as Necas because his recent track record hasn't nearly been as strong. So it's tough. I mean, there's a lot of question marks around all of this, and I think, we're not going to have a clearer picture of what the Jets are going for until probably sometime after the draft. But I just hope that they make some major aggressive moves because that's what this team needs is creativity. They need to go out there and really push for something big. I don't think you can have another quiet offseason that's not really notable by most stretches of the imagination. So food for thought, lots to consider and mull over. Let me know what you think the Jets are going to trade for here in the next couple of weeks. Do you think they're going to go for a center? Do you think it's going to be a defender? I know some of you have thought, perhaps they go for like a Chikrin or something. Maybe they try for a lower end defender. I saw somebody on Twitter even suggest like a Michael Matheson or something. So, I mean, the door's wide open, although sometimes it feels more like a threat. But in a little bit, I want to address an interesting comment somebody left on one of our earlier videos about, how easy it could be to arrange this team. And I want to talk about why, in my mind, I sort of have a differing perspective on this, especially for this upcoming season. We'll get to that in just a quick moment. Hey, friends, and welcome back to tonight's episode of Locked On Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode. We're just talking through some, Jets offseason stuff, and I wanted to address a comment that I thought was interesting from somebody from a couple of nights ago. The comment was left yesterday, but it's from an episode a couple of nights ago. And the comment was kind of talking about Winnipeg center depth. And I think that there was an assumption that Lambert could potentially fill into a second line center role relatively quickly. And for me, as much as I would love for that to be the case, I think we're actually going to see that not happen for a while. Brad is obviously a super creative player. He's very fun. And I think in his limited NHL time of one game, he did look like he belonged. I think that was clear that he's probably ready to take the next step. But I think when you're talking about second line center roles, you're talking about a really hefty responsibility lift for a guy who, while he's certainly been doing it for the Moose, he's not had a chance to do it at the NHL level. And I think it's going to be a lot to ask him to step up to this level and immediately hit the ground running within a few months. I know that we've seen a lot of young players have lots of success at the NHL level pretty early into their careers, especially in prime roles. But I think that's starting to shift where increasingly we're seeing more and more guys really having a tough time. Like Marco Rossi, who's really good for the Wild, has honestly struggled to find his footing at times at this level. You're not really seeing as many young players coming fresh out of junior or whatever, making the jump and having lots of immediate success. It's taken some marination. I think Perfetti is another example where I think he's a very good player right now, and I think he deserves more ice time. But I can also see an argument as to why his offense maybe hasn't exploded off the charts the way that it looked like it could have. I think he's starting to figure it out and put 2 and 2 together. But I think, the first year or so with him, definitely some early struggles. You could see that he was trying to process the game in NHL speed, and sometimes it didn't always come off. But I think recently he started to kind of turn around and look more and more like a really, really good forward for the Jets. But, I think we're increasingly finding it harder for young prospects to really make that jump. And so I think for me, it's why I've been hesitant to really anoint him as a top-level center yet, even for a third-line role. Like a third-line role on the Jets roster is probably a lot of responsibility for him. I don't want to say that you should just shove him at 4C, but I think if you're asking him to be a reasonably important contributor, but in a way that's going to protect him and give him confidence, asking him to play down the middle early might be tough. He would have to really be insulated, and I don't know if there's a way for the Jets to do that. One thing I would probably recommend is pairing him with Perfetti. I think Cole is probably one of the more defensively sound players on this team. He's certainly smart, and he'll read those passing lanes and jump in between to pick off pucks and stuff, but he also makes himself an effective outlet, and that's where I think he might be a really good safety valve for Lambert. Whether they actually do that, I don't know. And I think that there's a real question of also trying to balance the whole top line question where, Scheifele and Velarde should probably play together, but who plays on that left wing spot is, certainly a bit of a question. I'd love it to be Ehlers. It's probably not going to be. So do you go with Lambert? Probably not. Would you go with Connor? No. Let's avoid that. Perfetti, perhaps. But I mean, you're just dealing with a weird situation where because Ehlers is likely to depart, you have some real questionable gaps to fill. And I don't know that there's anyone internally that can really do this. Externally, you might look at a free agent or two, but I mean, how many top-end wingers are going to be available on the market that the Jets can realistically afford? You're probably looking at more of a stopgap solution until we start to see some of our other prospects like McGroarty near NHL competition. So it's weird. The Jets are in what I would call a bit of a limbo state, and it's why I feel like this lineup is going to be really complicated next year. I think the Jets are going to try and fill some of these gaps with young players, but I think it's going to be a real big learning curve. I think even if they force it, we're going to see the Jets struggle in a number of areas. I think it's going to be a lot of responsibility and expectation upon a couple of top young players and prospects. And sure, while some of them may thrive, you're not going to be able to really expect all of them to. And the guys that they kind of need to really get going are going to be players who really don't have much of an NHL record at this point. And so, as much as I want to be bullish on this team, I think I'm measuring expectations. I've kind of talked about this year being a year for growth. I still stick to that. I think that's going to be the most important thing. I think, it's more important for the Jets to sort of set the table for the future because the present looks like it's going to be probably more in the wild card territory. And, I don't think that that's necessarily a terrible outcome. I just think it's sort of the reality of where this team is. Winnipeg is not at an elite competitive level right now. I think that they're in a very vulnerable transition point. And so, this offseason really is critical for the front office to hit it out of the park and nail down some of their acquisitions. I do have more faith and optimism in the front office than I have in past years. I think that they have shown that they're capable and that they can really get the job done. But this is also a first offseason where we're going to have to see Chevy get really aggressive for like 3 or 4 different positions. That's a lot of stuff to kind of go shopping for. It's not like you can just buy wingers and centers and defenders off of Amazon and have them be top-end performers. I mean, the Jets are really going to have to dig deep to try and make some deals happen. So I don't know how I feel about all of it, but I will say that I don't think the lineups are going to be that simple and straightforward. And thinking about the left side wing position without Ehlers, it already opens up yet another hole for the Jets to fill. So all of this to say that I think this offseason feels more like a really difficult game of Tetris. And, I certainly don't envy the front office's job here, but hopefully, at the end of it, we're looking at a team that's likely to be fun, maybe even a playoff contender, and gives the youth enough support so that they're not isolated and finding themselves, plummeting either in ice time, confidence, or both as we get into the season. But let me know what your biggest concerns are with this team going forward. What are you worried about for next season? I may focus on this on our episode tomorrow, so drop them in the comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets on Twitter. For tonight's episode, though, that is going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here tomorrow. So, as always, have a great night and go Jets go.